The halcyon reach had never known the Empire's boot, until the morning the sky filled with iron. For 3 generations, the human colony of Marrow's Landing had grown quietly on the edge of the Vael corridor, a world of terraced farms and salt-white cities strung along a coast the color of old copper. Its people traded grain and machine parts, and the strange, delicate glasswork their artisans blew from volcanic sand. They were not soldiers. They had no fleet worth the name, only a handful of customs cutters and a defense grid that had not been fired in anger since the colony's founders had switched it on, and then, over long peaceful decades, mostly forgotten it existed. The Sovereign Ascendancy, the Empire, as the smaller worlds called it, always with the definite article, always with a lowered voice, had been expanding along the corridor for 200 standard years. It expanded the way rust expands, slowly, then all at once, and always inward, always claiming that what it took had somehow always been its own. Its ships were vast wedges of black alloy, and its officers wore the pale gray of ash, and its law was written in a single sentence that every conquered world learned by heart before it learned anything else. Compliance is mercy, everything else is choice. They came to Marrow's Landing on a clear, cold morning at the turn of the harvest, and they did not knock. Torin Vael was 19 years old and standing on the flat roof of the family grain house when the first shadow crossed the sun. He was tall in the way that had not yet finished, all elbows and reach, his dark hair cut short because his mother had done it herself the week before with the kitchen shears, laughing the whole time. He had a wrench in one hand and a half-repaired irrigation pump between his boots, and he was thinking about nothing more urgent than whether the seals would hold through winter. Then the light went strange, went gold to gray, and he looked up and saw the underside of something so large it had no edges he could find. The ship did not descend. It simply arrived, hanging over the harbor city of Solace Bay like a second and malevolent moon, and from its belly came smaller shapes, drop craft, ash gray and blunt, falling in ordered ranks toward the plazas and the port and the wide stone square where the market ran on harvest days. Torin's first thought was that it was a drill. His second thought, cold and immediate and correct, was that Marrow's Landing did not run drills, and that whatever this was, it was already happening. He was down the roof ladder before he had decided to move. The grain house sat on a rise above the eastern quarter, and from its yard he could see the market square a half-kilometer off, could see the crowd already turning, already beginning that slow, terrible ripple that a crowd makes when it does not yet know whether to be afraid. His mother was in the square. His father had gone down to the port at dawn to argue with a broker about the price of copper. And Kessa was in the square too. His sister, 8 years old, small for it, with their mother's stubborn chin and a gap where her front teeth were growing back in, and she had begged all week to be allowed to sell the glasswork from the little stall on harvest morning, to hand the coins across herself and make change like a grown woman, and their mother had finally said yes. Torin ran. He was fast. He had always been fast, the fastest in his school year, and he had never in his life had a reason that mattered. Now he had won, and it burned in him like a coal, and he took the terrace steps 4 at a time and cut through the alden orchard where the low branches whipped his face and he did not feel them. He could hear it now over the pounding of his own blood, a sound rolling up from the city, not a scream yet but the pressure before a scream, the sound of thousands of people all drawing breath at once. By the time he reached the top of the market stairs, the square below was full of ash-gray soldiers. They had come down in a ring, and they stood in the ring with the boredom of men who have done this 100 times on 100 worlds and expect this world to be no different. Their weapons were long and matte and cradled loosely, not raised. That was the thing Torin would remember afterward, the awful casualness of it, the way the guns were not even pointed at anyone. In the center of the square, on the wide stone lip of the harvest fountain, a single officer had climbed up to be seen. He was young himself, or young-looking, with the smooth, unlined face of someone who had never once in his life been told no. His gray coat was immaculate. His voice, when it came, was carried by some amplifier woven into his collar, so that it filled the square and rolled up the stairs and reached Torin where he stood frozen at the top, unable yet to find Kessa in the crowd. "Citizens of the Sovereign Ascendancy," the officer said, in accented but perfect trade standard, as though he were welcoming them to something rather than seizing them. "As of this hour, the world you have called Marrow's Landing is designated Compliance Sector 9 of the Vael Administrative Zone. Your governance is dissolved. Your defense grid is deactivated. Your registry, your harvest, and your industry are now assets of the Ascendancy, to be catalogued and allocated according to need." The crowd made its sound again, the pressure sound, and somewhere a woman began to cry, and the officer waited for it with the patience of a man waiting for a kettle. "You will find," he went on, "that we ask very little: registration, contribution, order. In return you receive the one thing your isolation has denied you, the protection of the largest power this arm of the galaxy has ever known. Compliance is mercy. I say it once so that you will remember it. Compliance is mercy. Everything else is a choice you make against yourselves." Torin's eyes swept the square. There the glasswork stall, near the fountain's eastern edge, the little folding table with its cloth and its careful rows of bright fragile things catching the morning light. And behind it, small, so small among all those gray-clad legs and all those frightened backs, a child with a gap-toothed face turning this way, and that looking, he knew instantly. He knew in his bones, looking for their mother, who had been pushed back with the rest of the crowd when the soldiers closed the ring. Kessa was inside the ring, alone. Torin started down the stairs. He would ask himself for the rest of his life whether it would have changed anything if he had stayed still. It would not have. He knew that eventually in the cold hours. But he would ask anyway, because grief is not a rational thing and it does not care what you know. What happened happened fast, the way the only truly important things ever do. A commotion started at the far side of the ring. A man, Torin never learned his name, a dockworker by his coat, thick through the shoulders and past all caution with fear, had gotten it into his head to push forward to reach a family member, to do something with the terror flooding through him. He shoved a soldier, not hard, not even hard enough to move the man. But he shoved, and he shouted, and a ripple of motion went through the crowd, that dangerous herd motion that soldiers everywhere are trained to fear more than any single enemy. The officer on the fountain lifted one gloved hand, almost lazily. A signal or the start of one. And a soldier, not the one who'd been shoved, but another, younger even than the officer, a boy really with a boy's twitching nerves, and a weapon he had never once fired at a living thing, turned toward the noise and the motion, and in the blind reflex of fear-meeting training, fired. He fired low. He fired without aiming. He fired at the crowd's motion the way you swat at a sound in the dark. Kessa had turned at the shouting. She had stepped out from behind the little table, toward the noise, because she was 8 and did not know that the correct response to danger was to make yourself small and still. She had stepped out to look for her mother. The bolt took her below the collarbone. She did not cry out. That was the thing Torin could never make sense of in all the years after, that there had been no scream, no sound at all from her, only the terrible small collapse of a body that had weighed almost nothing to begin with, folding down onto the sun-warmed stone beside the stall of bright glass she had so wanted to sell. For one full second the square was silent, absolutely silent. Even the soldier who had fired stood frozen, staring at what his hand had done. Then the sound came, not the pressure sound now. The scream itself, torn from 100 throats at once, and beneath it, cutting through it, a single voice that Torin realized only later had been his own, a raw animal sound with no words in it. The sound a person makes exactly once in a life, when something is torn out of the world that can never be put back. He reached her. He did not remember the stairs or the crowd or the soldiers who half turned toward him and then, seeing what he was running to, let him pass. He remembered only that he was suddenly on his knees on the warm stone with his sister in his arms, and that she was so light, lighter than she had any right to be, and that her eyes were open and fixed on the sky above the square where the great black ship still hung, blotting out the sun she had woken up to that morning. "Casa," he said. "Casa, Casa, no, look at me, look at me." She did not look at him. There was nothing left in her to look with. The gap where her teeth were growing back in, she had shown it to him that morning in the mirror, prodding it with her tongue, proud of the loss because it meant she was growing up. He held that thought and he could not let it go, and it would not stop. Around him the square had become a thing of pure chaos, the crowd surging and breaking against the ring of soldiers, and the soldiers falling back into a tighter defensive knot, weapons up now, all of them up and pointed, the casualness gone. On the fountain, the young officer stood with his gloved hand still half lifted, staring down at the small dark shape in the arms of the running boy, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered across that smooth, untroubled face that might, in a better man, have become shame. It did not become shame. The officer lowered his hand. He straightened his immaculate coat, and when he spoke again, his amplified voice cutting cold across the screaming square, he said the thing that Torin Vael would carry like a shard of glass in the meat of his heart for every day that followed, the thing that would remake him from a boy who fixed irrigation pumps into something the Empire had no name for and no defense against. "Regrettable," the officer said. "But a demonstration of the cost of disorder is not without instructional value. Let it be recorded. Compliance is mercy." He said it, and he stepped down from the fountain, and he walked away across the blood-slick stone as though he were leaving a room he had grown tired of. Torin knelt in the square with his dead sister in his arms and watched the man walk away, and something in him that had been soft and unformed and 19 years old went very still, and very cold and very clear. He memorized the face. He would learn later that its name was Sub-Prefect Torin Vael, third son of an Ascendancy house, ambitious, decorated, 26 years old, marked for greater things. He would learn a great deal later. But in that moment he knew only the face, and the immaculate coat, and the 4 words, and the walk, that unhurried, untroubled walk of a man who had killed a child and called it instruction. Torin Vael was 19 years old. He held his sister until the light left the square, and the soldiers withdrew to their ring, and his mother finally broke through and fell down beside them both and made sounds that were not words. And through all of it, some part of him stood apart, cold and clear and already counting, already beginning the long arithmetic that would end, though none of them could have known it then, least of all the Empire, with the stars themselves burning for what had been done here. They did not know what they had made. They would learn. They buried Kessa on the 3rd day, in the small terraced graveyard above the Alden orchard, where 3 generations of Vaels already slept beneath flat sea-colored stones. The Empire did not stop them. The Empire, in fact, took no notice at all. In the 3 days since the landing, Sub-Prefect Vael and his administration had been very busy, and a funeral was beneath their attention. They had raised their gray banners over the governance hall in Solace Bay. They had switched off the ancient defense grid and posted guards on the emitters so no one could switch it back on. They had begun the cataloguing the officer had promised. Every farm surveyed, every warehouse inventoried, every human being on Marrow's landing summoned in batches to a registration center, where their names and their skills and their blood were recorded in Ascendancy ledgers, so that the colony's people ceased to be people and became instead a list of assets, a spreadsheet of grain yield and machine hours and reproductive potential. Torin went to the registration center like everyone else. He stood in the long gray line and he gave his name and he let the machine read his blood and he said nothing, and the board functionary behind the counter tagged him labor class, agricultural, unremarkable, and waved him on. He memorized the layout of the building. He counted the guards. He noted where the cameras were and where they were not, and which of the soldiers watched the line and which of them watched their own boredom. He did all of this without deciding to, the way he had counted in the square. Some new engine had started up inside him, some machine of patient attention that never turned off now, not even in sleep. At the graveside there were perhaps 40 people. Neighbors, the orchard families, the artisans Kessa had loved to watch at their work. His mother stood in a black shawl and did not cry. She had cried herself hollow in the 3 days between, and now there was a stillness on her that frightened Torin more than any weeping would have. His father stood beside her, a big quiet man made suddenly old, his broker's ledgers forgotten, his hands hanging useless at his sides. Torin stood between his parents and looked at the small box going down into the terraced earth and felt, beneath the grief, the cold, clear engine turning, counting. The old priest of the coast faith spoke the words about the sea taking back what it lent. Torin did not hear most of them. But at the end, the priest, a man named Eden who had baptized Kessa and Torin both, who had known the family all their lives, looked up from his book and looked directly at Torin, and said something not in the liturgy. "There is a grief that makes a man smaller," Eden said quietly, so only the family could hear. "And there is a grief that makes him larger and more terrible, and I have buried enough of the young to know the difference by looking. I see which one this is, Torin. I will not tell you not to walk the road I see opening under your feet. I am too old and I have seen too much to lie to you today. I will only ask you to remember when you are far down it and cannot see the beginning any more that she was gentle. Whatever you become, be worthy of what she was. Do not let them make you into one of them." Torin looked at the old man for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and that was the only promise he ever made aloud about any of it, and it was the one he would spend the rest of his life keeping. That night, when his parents had finally been persuaded into the exhausted gray country that is not quite sleep, Torin went down alone to the grain-house workshop and lit the low lamp and sat at the long bench where he had rebuilt engines and mended pumps and fixed 100 broken things across his 19 years. He was good with broken things. It was the one gift he had. He could look at a machine that did not work and see, laid out clear as a diagram, the exact shape of what was wrong and the exact sequence of acts that would make it right. He looked now at the Empire the same way. He did not want vengeance. That was the first thing he understood, sitting there in the lamplight, and it surprised him, and he turned it over in his hands like an unfamiliar tool. What he felt was not the hot red thing the songs called vengeance. It was colder than that and older, and it had a shape. Kessa was dead. Nothing he did would undo that. He was 19, but he was not a fool, and he did not let himself pretend otherwise even for a moment. But the machine that had killed her was still running. It was running right now, all over Marrow's landing, cataloging and taking and calling it mercy. And it would go on running here, and on the next world and the world after that, until something made it stop. He could not make the whole empire stop. He knew that too. One boy with a wrench against the largest power in the arm of the galaxy. He did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was hopeless, and he did not care, because he was not trying to win a war. He was trying to fix a specific broken thing. He was trying to make it so that the men who had done this and the men who would do it again learned in their bodies the thing the sub-prefect had said and did not believe, that everything has a cost. That compliance was not mercy and never had been, that it was only the absence, so far, of consequence, and that consequence could be supplied. He was going to supply it. Not to the frightened boy who had fired the shot. Torin had thought about that in the 3 cold days, thought about it more than he wanted to admit, because that boy's face had been in the square too, and that boy's hand had held the weapon. But even then, even in the first raw days, some part of the old Torin, the part Eden had seen, the part Kessa had loved, held the line. The boy who fired had been afraid and stupid and 19 or 20 like Torin himself, and he had been made into a weapon by the men above him and pointed at a crowd and told that pointing weapons at crowds was order. Killing that boy would be like blaming the bolt for the shot. It would feel like something. it would accomplish nothing. And it would be, Torin understood with sudden and absolute clarity, exactly the thing Eden had warned him against. It would be letting them make him into one of them, a man who solved his fear and his grief by pointing weapons at whoever was nearest. No. If there was to be a reckoning, and there was going to be a reckoning, he had decided that in the square with his sister's blood on his hands, then it would be aimed. It would be precise. It would climb, link by link, up the chain that had ended in his sister's death, and it would find the men who had built the machine and given the orders and called it mercy, and it would present them, one by one, with the bill. He began that night. Not with violence, he was not ready, and he was not stupid, and a boy with a wrench who threw himself at armored soldiers in the first week would simply be dead, and being dead would help no one. He began the way he began any repair, by understanding the machine. He had a friend from school, Nara Soul, who had gone into the colony's communications trade and knew the old networks the way Torin knew engines. The buried cables and the relay towers and the dark unmonitored channels that predated the Empire, and that the Empire in its arrogance had not yet bothered to find. He went to her the next day, and he did not have to explain. She had been in the square too, at the back, and she had a younger brother Kessa's age, and when Torin said only, "I need to know how they talk to each other," Nara looked at him for a long moment and then said, "I've been waiting for someone to ask me that." Over the following weeks, while the Empire settled into Marrow's landing like a tenant who intends to stay, while the harvest was seized and shipped, and the people were set to labor, and the gray banners faded to a slightly less crisp gray in the coastal rain, Torin learned the machine. He learned it patiently from a dozen sources, none of whom knew of the others. From Nara he learned the shape of the Empire's communications, how the garrison talked to the orbital ship, how the ship talked to the Vael administrative zone, how orders flowed down and reports flowed up. From an old woman named Sella who cleaned the governance hall, he learned the rhythm of the officers' days, when they ate and where they slept, and which of them drank and which of them prayed. From a dock foreman named Palt he learned the movement of Ascendancy supplies, the fuel and the ammunition and the ration crates, and where they were stored and how they were guarded and how, with the right knowledge, a shipment might be made to simply disappear. And from the Empire itself, from the ledgers he glimpsed, and the announcements he heard and the swaggering talk of off-duty soldiers in the confiscated taverns, he learned the chain of command. He learned the names. Sub-Prefect Corin Hallex, who had walked away across the square, he was the local head, the administrator of Compliance Sector 9, but he was not the top of the chain, only a middle link, an ambitious young man doing what ambitious young men in the Ascendancy did to be noticed. Above him was Prefect Austin Vael, who ruled the whole Vael administrative zone from a fortress station 3 jumps away. A hard old career administrator who had catalogued 100 worlds and buried 100 Kessas without once losing a night's sleep. And above Vael, dimly, at a height Torin could barely make himself imagine, was the machinery of the Ascendancy proper, the sovereign and the high compliance and all the vast gray apparatus that had eaten a quarter of the galaxy one world at a time. Torin drew the chain in his mind, link by link, from the frightened boy at the bottom to the height he could not see. And then he set the boy aside, because the boy was not the machine, and he looked at the first real link. Corin Hallex, the immaculate coat, the unhurried walk. 26 years old, third son of a house, decorated, ambitious, marked for greater things, and every single day, walking the same route from his commandeered residence in the governor's old mansion to the governance hall and back, protected by guards who had grown bored and careless because nothing on this soft farming world had ever threatened them, because the humans of Marrow's landing were assets, were labor class, were unremarkable. Torin looked at that link for a long time. Then he began, very quietly, to take it apart. The first strike was not a killing. Torin had thought about this a great deal, and he had decided that the first thing the Empire needed to learn was not fear of death. Soldiers were trained against that, but the far more corrosive fear of being seen. An occupier's power rests on a single unspoken belief, that it moves through the conquered world unobserved and untouchable, that the people beneath its boot are furniture, are scenery, are a landscape without agency or attention. The moment that belief cracks, the moment the occupier realizes it is being watched, studied, understood, something changes in the marrow of every soldier who wears the gray. Torin meant to crack that belief. And he meant to do it in a way that killed no one, because the killing, when it came, had to mean something, and it could not mean anything if it came cheap and early and to the wrong men. So he began with the supply chain, because Pult, the dock foreman, had shown him where the seams were. The Empire's fuel came down from the orbital ship in great sealed drums and was stored in a bunkered depot at the edge of the port, guarded by a squad who rotated in shifts and who had, over the soft months, stopped truly watching. Torin did not attack the depot. That would have been noticed, would have brought reprisal down on the colony, would have gotten innocent people killed, and getting innocent people killed was the Empire's method, not his. The whole point was to be the opposite of them. Instead, over the course of a single moonless night, using nothing but the knowledge Pult had given him, and the mechanical gift that was the one thing he truly owned, Torin got into the depot's manifest system. Nara had shown him the way in through the buried cable, and he changed the numbers. He did not steal the fuel, he made the fuel lie. He altered the manifest so that drums recorded as full read empty, and drums recorded as empty read full, and the whole careful catalog of the depot, that catalog the Empire loved so much, that catalog by which it turned the world into a spreadsheet, quietly became false. When the garrison went to fuel their patrol craft the next week, half the drums they drew were water. When they tried to reconcile the accounts, the numbers made no sense, could not be made to make sense, contradicted themselves at every turn. It looked, for all the world, like the incompetence of their own quartermaster, and it cost them a week of grounded patrols and a savage internal investigation that turned 3 Ascendancy officers against one another and ended 2 careers. Torin watched it happen from a distance, from the roof of the grain house with a pair of old farmer's field glasses, and he felt nothing that he would have called satisfaction. He felt the cold engine turning, and he felt the shape of the next repair, and beneath both of those, very quietly, he felt Kessa, not as grief now but as a kind of aim, a fixed point he oriented by, the way a sailor orients by a star. The Empire never knew a human hand had touched the manifests. That was the beauty of it, and Torin understood the beauty coldly and completely. Let them suspect nothing yet. Let them tear at each other. Let the belief in their own unobserved supremacy do the first damage from the inside. He was not in a hurry. He understood, the rest of his life for this, and he intended to be very patient and very precise, and to let the Empire teach itself for as long as possible that its wounds were self-inflicted, until the day he wanted it to know with absolute certainty that they were not. The second strike a month later was aimed higher. By now Torin had built something. Not an army. Marrow's landing had no army, and an army would have been the wrong tool anyway, a hammer where a scalpel was wanted. What he had built was a network, thin and quiet and nearly invisible, a dozen people who each knew one small piece and none of whom knew Torin's full shape. Nara at the heart of the communications, Pult at the docks, old Sella in the governance hall, a handful of others, a medic, a ground car mechanic, a woman who ran the last independent freight route off-world under an Ascendancy license and who owed the Empire nothing but grief. They called themselves nothing. They had no banner. That was deliberate. Torin had watched enough of the Empire to understand that a resistance with a banner is a resistance that can be found and named and made into a story the occupier controls. He wanted the opposite of a story. He wanted a ghost. The second strike took the ghost into the governance hall. Subprefect Hallex, Torin had learned, kept a private ledger, not the great official catalog of the colony's assets, a smaller, personal thing, encrypted, that he consulted often and guarded closely, and that old Sella had glimpsed once over his shoulder while emptying his waste bin. Torin wanted that ledger, not to destroy it, to read it. Because a man's private accounts tell you what a man truly values, and what a man truly values tells you where he can be hurt, and Torin was not interested in hurting Halix's body yet. He was interested first in understanding exactly what Halix was. It took 3 weeks to get in. Nara found the seam in the hall's network. Sella provided the physical access, a single unlocked service door on a single predictable evening, and Torin himself went in, alone, dressed as a cleaner, moving through the corridors of the building where his sister's killer slept with the cold, patient attention that never turned off now. He did not go armed. If he had been caught, being armed would only have gotten him shot. Being an unremarkable labor-class cleaner in the wrong corridor might, with luck, only have gotten him beaten and released. He weighed the risk and accepted it, and he found the terminal Sella had described, and Nara's key opened it, and Torin copied the private ledger of Corin Halix onto a chip the size of his thumbnail, and he walked back out through the service door into the coastal night, and no alarm ever sounded. He read the ledger for 3 days. What he found in it remade his understanding of the whole shape of things, and it hardened the cold engine into something with a purpose beyond one man's death. The ledger was a record of theft, not the Empire's official theft, the cataloging and requisition that the Ascendancy did openly and called mercy, but Halix's own private skimming, a career's worth of it, world after world. Halix had been diverting a fraction of every conquered world's seized wealth into accounts that were his alone. He had done it on the last 3 worlds he had administered. He was doing it here, on Marrow's landing, right now, siphoning grain and copper and glasswork off the top of the official requisitions, and selling it through the very freight routes the Empire pretended to control, building himself a private fortune off the backs of the worlds he broke. And more than that, the ledger recorded, in Halix's own careful hand, his contempt. Contempt for the worlds he took, for the people he catalogued, for the Empire itself, which he regarded as a slow, stupid engine to be ridden upward and bled along the way. He had called Kessa's death, in the private ledger, a fortunate accident. He had written that the demonstration value of the incident had accelerated compliance in Sector 9 by an estimated 11%, and that he intended to note this efficiency in his next report to Prefect Vane, as it reflected well on his administration. 11%. He had done the arithmetic. He had turned Kessa into a number, into a percentage of accelerated compliance, and he had written it down in his private ledger with satisfaction, and he had planned to take credit for it. Torin read that entry, and he sat very still in the lamplight of the grain-house workshop for a long time, and the old Torin, the boy who had fixed pumps, who had promised Eden at the graveside, rose up in him and wanted, for one white-hot moment, to abandon all the patience and all the precision and simply go and kill Corin Halix with his hands. He did not. He put the ledger down and he went out into the dark and he walked up to the terrace graveyard and he sat by his sister's flat sea-colored stone until the cold went all the way through him. And by the time the first gray light came up over the copper sea, he had the whole thing clear again, colder than ever and clearer. Killing Halix would be a mercy. That was the thing he understood, sitting by the grave. A bolt through the head in a dark corridor would be over in an instant, and Halix would die still believing himself clever, still believing himself untouchable, still believing that the world was furniture and he was the only one truly awake in it. That was not a reckoning. That was just another death in a galaxy full of them. No, Halix had built himself a private machine of theft and contempt, and he had written his crimes down in his own hand, and Torin was very, very good with machines. He was going to take Halix's machine apart the way he had taken apart the fuel depot's manifests, quietly, precisely, from the inside, and he was going to let the Empire's own catalog, the Empire's own love of ledgers and accounts and demonstration value, do the work. He was going to make Corin Halix's crimes visible to the one audience Halix truly feared, the empire above him. He was going to hand the private ledger, with its skimming and its contempt and its 11%, to Prefect Austin Vael. Not to save Halix's victims. It was too late for that. It was always too late. That was the whole grief of it. But because a reckoning aimed at the machine had to use the machine's own weight against it, and because the sweetest and most terrible justice for a man who believed himself, the only one awake, was to be judged and destroyed by the very empire he had held in contempt, by the gray apparatus he had thought too stupid to notice him. Let Vael find the ledger. Let the empire eat its own. And when Halix had been stripped and disgraced and dragged before the Ascendancy's cold accounting, then Torin would climb to the next link, and the one after, and he would keep climbing, aimed and precise and merciless and clean, until either they killed him or he reached the top of the chain and made the whole machine understand, in its own ledgers, in its own language of accounts and demonstrations and cost, the exact price of one gap-toothed girl who had only wanted to make change like a grown woman on a bright harvest morning. He went back down to the grain house as the sun cleared the sea. His mother was awake, standing at the window with a cup of something cooling in her hands, watching him climb down from the graveyard. She looked at his face for a long moment, the way Eden had, the way people had started to look at him. "You're not sleeping," she said. "No," he said. She looked at him a while longer. Then she said very quietly, "Your sister used to say you could fix anything." Her voice did not break. It had gone past breaking. "Fix this, Torin. I don't care what it costs. Fix this." He did not answer, but he crossed the room and he put his arms around his mother, who had gone so still and so hollow, and he held her the way he had held Kessa in the square. And over her shoulder he looked out the window at the gray banners hanging in the distance over Solace Bay, and the cold engine turned and began the next repair. Getting the ledger to Prefect Vael was the hardest piece of machining Torin had yet attempted, and it taught him more about the empire than everything before it combined. He could not simply send it. A message from Marrow's landing to the prefect of the Vael zone accusing a sub-prefect of corruption would be intercepted by that sub-prefect's own people, and the messenger would be found, and the messenger would die, and Halix would learn that someone on this soft world was awake and hunting, and Torin was not ready to be known. Not yet. When the Empire learned it was being hunted, it had to be at a time and in a shape of his choosing, not a fumble. So he did not send the ledger to Vael. He arranged for Vael to find it, in the course of the Empire's own machinery, in a way that pointed at no human hand at all. It took 2 more months. Nara found the routing, the automated audit channels by which the Vael administrative zone periodically sampled the accounts of its sectors, a dry bureaucratic pipeline that Halix, in his contempt, had never imagined anyone would use against him. Torin did not forge anything. Forgery could be detected, and a forgery discovered would exonerate Halix and burn the whole operation. Instead, he did something cleaner and far more devastating. He arranged, through the manifest access he already controlled and the audit routing Nara had mapped, for Halix's own private ledger, the real one, the true one, in Halix's own hand, to be caught in the zone's next automated audit sample and flagged as an anomaly requiring the prefect's personal review. He made the Empire's own catalog reach out and pick up the evidence, the way the Empire's catalog picked up everything, and carry it upward to the one man Halix feared. Then he stepped back, and he waited, and he watched the machine devour itself. It happened faster than even Torin had expected, and colder. Prefect Austin Vael was not a merciful man, but he was a meticulous one, and meticulous men do not forgive theft, because theft is disorder and disorder is the one thing the meticulous cannot abide. Word came down the corridor within weeks, carried on the channels Nara monitored. Sub-Prefect Corin Halix was to report to the fortress station of the Vael administrative zone for a review of his accounts. Halix went. He had no choice. To refuse a summons was to confess. He left Marrow's landing on an Ascendancy cutter in his immaculate gray coat, believing, Sella reported, that it was a routine matter he could talk his way through, believing himself clever, believing himself awake in a world of furniture. He did not come back. What came back 3 weeks later was an announcement on the Empire's own public channels, terse and total. Torin Vael, formerly sub-prefect of Compliance Sector 9, had been found guilty of the systematic diversion of Ascendancy assets. His house had disowned him. His accounts had been seized. His rank had been stripped. He had been consigned to the labor penal facilities of the Deep Corridor, to a place from which no one returned, to spend whatever remained of his life doing the very labor he had catalogued and despised on world after conquered world. The Empire had eaten him, and it had done so believing entirely that it had done it itself. Torin heard the announcement standing in the port, among a crowd of humans set to loading Ascendancy freight, and he did not smile, and he did not weep, and he did not let a single line of his face move. But that night he went up to the terraced graveyard, and he sat by the flat sea-colored stone, and he said, quietly, to the dark, "That's one, Kessa, the man who walked away, that's one." It was not enough. It would never be enough. He had made his peace with that in the first cold days, the arithmetic that never balanced. But it was aimed, and it was clean, and no innocent had died to accomplish it, and the man who had turned his sister into a percentage was now himself a number in a ledger of the damned, doing labor in the dark until he died. Torin had used the Empire's own weight to break the first link of the chain, and the Empire had not even known a human was in the room. That would not last, and Torin, planning the next link, understood that it should not. Because here was the thing he had come to understand in all the months of patient machining. The manifests and the ledger and the quiet devouring of Hallex had been the work of a ghost, and a ghost in the end could not do what needed doing. A ghost could break links from the inside, one at a time, invisibly, but the whole point of a reckoning, the thing that separated it from mere sabotage, was that eventually the Empire had to know. Not just be hurt. No. Know that it was being hurt, and by whom and why. Know that the furniture had risen, that the assets were awake, that the soft farming world it had catalogued and dismissed had grown in its grief, a consequence. The Empire had to be taught the lesson the sub-prefect had smugly recited and never believed. And you cannot teach a lesson to something that does not know it is in a classroom. So Torin changed the shape of the war. The new sub-prefect who came to replace Hallex was a harder and more careful man named Docent Reich, older, with the flat, watchful eyes of a career security officer rather than an ambitious administrator. Reich had read the Hallex file. Reich did not believe, as Hallex had, that Marrow's landing was soft. Reich tightened the garrison, doubled the patrols, and began, slowly, methodically, to look for the thing he could not name but could feel, the thing that had made the accounts of Sector 9 behave so strangely for so long. Reich was, in his way, the first Ascendancy officer to sense that something on this world was awake. Torin let him sense it, and then, at the moment of his own choosing, he let him see it. The strike that announced the ghost was, like all of Torin's work, precise, aimed, and bloodless, and it was designed above everything to be understood. On the anniversary of the landing, on the very morning a year after the great black ship had blotted out the sun over the market square, every screen in every Ascendancy facility on Marrow's landing, the governance hall, the registration center, the garrison barracks, the depot, the officers' commandeered mansions, went dark at the same instant, and then lit again all at once, all showing the same thing. It was not a threat. It was not a manifesto. Torin had thought about this longer than about anything else, and he had decided that a threat would be answered with a threat, and a manifesto would be answered with contempt, and both would be the Empire's own language, the language of demonstration and cost, and he would not speak the Empire's language. What every screen showed was a single image, held in silence for 1 full minute and then gone. A photograph of a small folding table with a cloth on it and rows of bright fragile glasswork catching the morning light, and behind it empty now, the place where a child had stood. No blood, no body, no name, no demand, just the empty stall and the bright glass and the light, and beneath it in plain trade standard, 4 words that were not the Empire's 4 words but their answer. Everything has a cost. Then the screens went back to normal, and the Ascendancy officers of Marrow's landing looked at one another in the sudden ordinary light. And for the first time since the great ship had arrived, every one of them felt the cold, particular fear of the occupier who has just realized he is being watched. Docent Reich understood it faster than the others. He had read the Halleck's file. He knew already in his bones that something on this world was awake, and now the something had spoken, and it had spoken not in threats but in grief, which frightened him far more, because a thing that acts out of grief and calls it cost is not a thing that can be bought or frightened or catalogued. He put the garrison on alert. He ordered a search. He tore the network apart looking for the point of intrusion and found nothing, because Nara had built the Ghost's road through cables the Empire had never mapped. He interrogated the human staff of the governance hall, old Sella among them, and got nothing, because Sella knew only her one small piece and had told it to no one who could be found. And out in the terraces and the orchards and the salt-white streets of Solace Bay, something else happened, something Torin had hoped for and worked toward but could not have commanded. The people of Marrow's landing saw the empty stall on the Empire's own screens, and they understood it, all of them instantly and completely in a way no outsider ever could. They knew the stall. They knew the glass. They knew, every single one of them, whose empty place that was. And a colony that had spent a year in the gray silence of the catalogued and the compliant felt, for the first time, the thing the Empire most feared its assets ever feeling. That they were not alone, that something in the dark was awake and on their side, that the boot on their neck was not, after all, beyond consequence. They did not rise up. Torin did not want them to rise up. An uprising was a hammer and it would get them slaughtered, and slaughter was the Empire's craft and not his. But they began, quietly in 1,000 small ways, to help the Ghost. A patrol route noted and passed along a chain of whispers. A supply movement observed. A door left unlocked. An officer's habits remembered. The network Torin had built thickened without his ever recruiting a soul, as the whole world leaned, quietly and invisibly, toward the thing in the dark that had shown them the empty stall and told them the truth. Everything has a cost. Docent Reich felt the world shift under him and did not understand it, and reported to Prefect Vael that Compliance Sector 9 was experiencing an anomalous decline in cooperation, source unknown, and requested reinforcement. And Prefect Austin Vael, 3 jumps away in his fortress station, meticulous and merciless and entirely certain of his own supremacy, read the report and frowned and made a note in his own ledger, and began, for the first time, to turn his cold attention personally toward the soft farming world where 2 of his sub-prefects had now, inexplicably, come to grief. Torin, on the roof of the grain house with the old field glasses, watched the garrison's lights burn late into the night for the first time since the landing, and he understood that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The Ghost had spoken. The Empire knew now that it was being hunted. From here there was no more hiding, only climbing link by link, up the chain, toward the meticulous old man in the fortress station, and the height beyond him that Torin still could barely make himself imagine. He was ready. He had been ready since the square. "Everything has a cost," he said quietly to the burning garrison lights. "Come and learn what it is." Prefect Austin Vael came to Marrow's landing himself. It was a measure of how far the Ghost had shifted things that a prefect of the Vael administrative zone would deign to descend to a single soft farming world at the edge of the corridor. Prefects did not travel. Prefects sat in fortress stations and moved worlds around on ledgers. But Vael had lost 2 sub-prefects to this place. One to corruption uncovered by an audit that no one could quite explain, and one, Docent Reich, who had not fallen but who was reporting a steady, inexplicable erosion of control. and Vain was meticulous, and the meticulous do not tolerate an anomaly they cannot personally see and correct. So the great black wedge of a zone flagship arrived in the sky over Solace Bay, larger even than the ship that had first blotted out the sun, and Prefect Vain descended in a heavily armored shuttle with a personal guard of ash-gray elite soldiers, and he set up his cold court in the governance hall, and he began, methodically, to hunt. Vain did not make Halix's mistake. He did not believe the world was furniture. He had read every file and he understood, insofar as a man like Vain could understand anything that ran on grief, that somewhere on this world was a single intelligence, patient and precise and aimed, that had broken his machine from the inside. He did not know it was a boy. He assumed, as such men always do, that it was an organization, a trained cell, off-world backing professional operators. He could not conceive that the thing hunting the Vael zone was a 19-year-old, 20 now, who fixed irrigation pumps and had never in his life been trained to anything but the mending of broken machines. And because Vain assumed an organization, Vain hunted the way the Empire always hunted an organization, by making the population bleed until the organization revealed itself to stop the bleeding. This was the overreach Torin had known would come, and had dreaded, and had prepared for as best a person can prepare for the thing that will test whether they are still themselves. Vain instituted collective accountability. It was an old ascendancy method, refined over 200 years of eating worlds. For every act against the Empire, a price extracted not from the perpetrator, who could not be found, but from the population that sheltered him. He announced it in the market square, on the very stones, and Torin stood in the crowd and listened to the meticulous old voice lay out the arithmetic of it, and understood that Vain had just done the one thing that could truly threaten everything. He had made Torin's war expensive for everyone but Torin. The terms were precise. Sabotage would be answered by requisition, a farm seized, a family displaced. Intrusion into ascendancy systems would be answered by detention, names drawn from the registry, held indefinitely. And any act that damaged ascendancy personnel would be answered in kind and in multiple. For one soldier, 10 of the registry. Vain did not shout it. He recited it the way an accountant recites a balance, and then he looked out over the silent crowd with his cold, meticulous eyes and said, "You harbor a thing that believes everything has a cost. Very well. I agree with it entirely. I have only come to correct its arithmetic. It has been billing the wrong account. From today, its every act will be paid for by you." Then he waited to see what the thing in the dark would do. It was, Torin understood, standing frozen in the crowd, a very good move. It was the move of a man who truly understood the shape of the war, better than Halix ever had, better perhaps than Torin had given the Empire credit for. Vain had grasped the ghost's one weakness, that the ghost fought clean, that the ghost cared, that the ghost had shown the whole world an empty stall and told them everything has a cost precisely because the ghost could not bear the cost of the innocent. Vain had taken that caring and turned it into a leash. Act, and your own people pay. Stop, and the Empire wins. He had built a trap out of Torin's own conscience, and Torin had walked the whole colony into it by teaching them to hope. That night Torin did not go to the graveyard. He went to Nara's, and he sat in the back room where the ghost's few true lieutenants gathered: Nara, Palt, the freight runner named Ren, the medic Os. And for the first time since the square, he did not know what to do, and he said so. "If I act, they bleed our people," he said. "Vain's not wrong about me. He read me exactly. He knows I won't spend the innocent to win. So he's going to make every move I make cost the innocent until either I stop and let him win and let it all have been for nothing and let Kessa's stall on those screens turn into a lie, or I keep going and become exactly the thing he says I am, a thing that gets its own people killed to make a point. That's the trap. Stop or become one of them." It was Palt, the old dock foreman, who answered, and Torin never forgot it. "You're thinking like him," Palt said. "You're doing his arithmetic. He set it up so there's only two answers and both of them are his. But you never fought his way, boy. That was the whole point of you from the first manifest you flipped. You didn't fight the Empire's war. You found the seam and you took the machine apart from inside where it didn't even know it was being touched. So don't fight his arithmetic. Break it. Find the seam. Torin sat with that for 3 days, and on the 3rd day he found the seam, and it was the truest thing he ever learned about the Empire. Vane's collective accountability rested on a hidden assumption, the same rotten assumption at the base of the whole ascendancy, that the population and the ghost were separate, that there was a thing in the dark and a herd of frightened assets, and that you could hold the herd hostage against the thing. But that had stopped being true a year ago, on the morning the empty stall appeared on every screen. The people of Marrow's landing were no longer a herd being held hostage against the ghost. They were the ghost. The whole world had leaned into the dark, quietly, invisibly, and a hostage who has decided he is a soldier is no longer a hostage at all. So Torin did the thing Vane could not have predicted, because it required understanding the human beings Vane had catalogued as assets. He did not stop, and he did not escalate against personnel, and he did not walk into Vane's trap of blood. Instead, he took the war entirely into the one domain where no human being could be made to pay for it. The Empire's own machine, its ledgers and manifests and cold accounts, the very apparatus Vane loved and trusted and could not function without. And he did it in the open, and he did it in a way that told every soul on Marrow's landing what was being asked of them, and gave them the choice, the free choice, the uncoerced choice. The exact opposite of compliance is mercy, to be part of it or not. Through the ghost's thickened network, the message went out across the colony, quiet and total, whispered and passed and understood. The Empire runs on our labor and our accounts, not our blood, our labor. Vane can only bill you if you are still paying in, so stop paying in. Not a strike they can crush, something smaller and larger, work slower, remember worse, count wrong, lose things. Every one of you knows 100 ways a machine breaks when the people running it stop caring whether it runs. You have been broken things in their catalog for a year. Be broken things on purpose. It was not a call to arms. It was a call to friction, and it could not be answered with collective accountability because there was no act to punish. Only an entire world of catalogued assets quietly, deniably, individually deciding to be a little less useful, a little less accurate, a little more forgetful, a little slower, in 10,000 invisible ways that no ledger could isolate and no firing squad could deter. You cannot execute a colony for working slowly. You cannot requisition a farm for a harvest that came in a little short. You cannot detain a registry for a manifest that got the numbers wrong. Not when every manifest on the world is wrong. Not when the wrongness is everywhere and nowhere, and looks exactly like the ordinary friction of a conquered people who have simply, quietly, stopped trying. Vane's meticulous machine began, that month, to grind. It did not break, not yet, not from this alone. But it slowed, and it fouled, and its numbers stopped meaning anything, and its every attempt to reassert order met the soft, immovable resistance of a whole world that had decided, freely and invisibly, to stop cooperating with its own consumption. And every time Vane reached for his weapon of collective accountability, he found nothing to aim it at, no perpetrator, no act, no blood, only the vast gray friction of the ordinary and the deniable, the friction of human beings who had remembered that they were human beings and not entries in a book. And through it all, aimed and precise and clean, the ghost kept working. But now the ghost worked with a whole world at its back, invisibly, and Vane's leash of conscience had been not cut but dissolved, because the innocent Vane had meant to hold hostage had stopped being available as hostages the moment they chose, each of them, to be soldiers of friction instead. Torin had found the seam. He had refused both of Vane's answers and broken the arithmetic that framed them. He had held the line Eden had drawn at the graveside. no innocence spent, no descent into the Empire's method. And he had done it not by retreating but by understanding, more deeply than Vain ever could, what human beings were and what they would freely give when someone finally told them the truth and trusted them with it. But he understood, too, standing on the grain house roof watching Vane's flagship hang dark and enormous over the harbor, that friction alone would not finish it. Friction could grind the machine. It could not break the man. And Prefect Austin Vain, meticulous, merciless, personally present now, personally invested, personally humiliated by a world that would not be catalogued, was the next link in the chain, the hardest link yet, and he was not 3 jumps away in a fortress anymore. He was here, on the ground, within reach. Torin looked at the flagship, and he did the arithmetic, the real arithmetic, the aimed and careful arithmetic he had been doing since the square, and he began to plan the reckoning of Austin Vain. Austin Vain was not Corin Hallex. He could not be devoured by the Empire's own machine, because he was the Empire's own machine, meticulous and clean and without a private ledger of skimmed wealth to be hung by. He kept no secret theft. He held nothing back for himself. He believed, entirely and sincerely, in the gray apparatus he served, and a man who sincerely believes cannot be destroyed by exposing his hypocrisy, because he has none. He was, in his cold way, honest, the honesty of a machine, which does not steal because it does not want, which catalogues and consumes worlds not out of greed, but out of the pure conviction that consumption is order and order is the highest good. Torin studied Vain for 2 months, patient as ever, while the world's friction ground the garrison down, and Vain grew colder and more present and more dangerous. And what Torin came to understand was that Vain could not be beaten the way Hallex had been beaten, because Vain had no hidden self to be turned against him. There was no seam of corruption to widen. Vain's only weakness was the very thing that made him strong, his absolute belief in the Empire's supremacy, his absolute inability to conceive that a soft, catalogued world could truly threaten the Ascendancy, his meticulous certainty that everything, every anomaly, every friction, every ghost, could ultimately be reduced to a manageable entry in a book and corrected. That certainty was the seam, not a flaw in the man, the whole of the man. Torin was going to make Austin Vain's supremacy the instrument of his fall, was going to let the meticulous machine's absolute confidence in its own control carry it precisely off the cliff it could not imagine existed. The plan was the most dangerous thing Torin had ever built, and it required, for the first time, that the ghost step out of the dark and stand where Vain could see him, because Vain, unlike Hallex, would never fall to a trap sprung from the shadows. Vain trusted only what he could catalogue with his own cold eyes, so Torin would give him something to catalogue. He would give Vain the ghost, or what Vain would believe was the ghost, and he would let Vain's certainty that he had finally caught the thing hunting his zone become the very hook that pulled him down. Here is what Torin did in the 3rd month of the friction, when Vain's machine was ground half to a halt, and the prefect's cold patience had begun, at last, to fray. Through the ghost's network, deniably, in the way rumors move through a conquered world, Torin let a single piece of information reach Vain, that the intelligence hunting the Vael zone was not an organization at all, but one person, a single human, unbacked, untrained, operating alone, who had broken 2 sub-prefects and ground a world to friction with nothing but a genius for machines and an unbearable grief. And Torin let Vain learn where this person would be, on a specific night, alone and unguarded, in an abandoned relay station on the northern cape. A place Torin chose because he had spent a month rebuilding its ancient bones into something no one, least of all Vain, would ever suspect. Vain could not resist. That was the whole of the plan, and it rested entirely on Torin's reading of the man. A meticulous prefect, humiliated by a ghost, offered the chance to personally catalogue and correct the single human responsible for the anomaly, to see with his own cold eyes the thing that had defied the Ascendancy, and to end it with his own hand, and to file the report that would restore his order and his reputation both. Vain could no more resist that than water could resist running downhill. His supremacy demanded it. His certainty required it. He would come himself with his elite guard to the relay station on the Northern Cape to catalog and correct the boy who had defied the Empire. And Torin would be there, alone as promised, unarmed as was his way, waiting. Not to kill Vain. Torin had thought about this longer and harder than about anything since the ledger, and he had held again the line. He could have killed Vain. The whole trap could as easily have been a bomb, could have ended the prefect and his guard in a single clean instant. But that would have been the Empire's method. The demonstration, the cost, the answering of a summons with a firing squad. And it would have made Torin into exactly the thing Vain had tried to make him, a thing that ends its enemies with a bolt in the dark. Eden's voice from the graveside, do not let them make you into one of them. Kessa's gentleness, the fixed star he steered by, no, Vain would not be killed. Vain would be caught, and shown, and undone by the Empire itself, as Halleck's had been, but this time undone by his own supremacy, his own certainty, his own conviction that a soft world could be catalogued and corrected. The night came, Vain came with it. He descended on the Northern Cape in his armored shuttle with a dozen of his ash-gray elite, and he entered the abandoned relay station with the cold confidence of a man arriving to close a file, and he found, in the central chamber, exactly what he had been promised. A single human, young, unarmed, standing alone in the middle of the ancient room, waiting for him. Torin Vael, 20 years old, looked at the man who had put a leash of blood on his whole world and who had come to correct him. And he did not run, and he did not attack, and he did not beg. He simply looked with the cold, clear, steady attention that never turned off now, and he let Vain see him, and Vain looked back with his meticulous eyes and understood, at last and too late, exactly what he was looking at, not an organization, not a cell, not off-world professionals, but a boy. A farm boy with a wrench, who had done all of this alone, out of grief, and who was standing here now unarmed and unafraid in a trap that Vain, in his supremacy, had walked into without once imagining it could be a trap. You, Vain said just that. His cold voice cracked, very slightly, on the single word, because a meticulous man's whole world depends on his catalog being correct, and Vain had just discovered that his catalog had been wrong about everything, from the very beginning, about the nature of the enemy and the nature of the world, and the nature of the soft assets he had spent his life consuming. Me, Torin agreed quietly. Just me. There was never anyone else, Prefect. There was never an organization. There was never off-world backing. There was one person who understood machines and one world full of people you decided were furniture and a girl who wanted to sell glass on a harvest morning. That's all it ever was. That's all it ever took. And then Torin told him what the relay station was. For a month, Torin had rebuilt its ancient bones. The relay station on the Northern Cape had once, in the colony's founding days, been part of the old defense grid. The same grid the Empire had switched off and posted guards over and then forgotten, in its supremacy, that it had ever needed to think about again. But a grid is not one thing. It is a web, and a web has many nodes, and the Empire had switched off and guarded the emitters and never thought about the relay stations at all, because relay stations relayed and did not fire, and were therefore beneath a conqueror's attention. Torin, who understood machines, had understood that the relay station could be made to do more than relay. He had spent a month, with Nara and Palt and the world's quiet help, turning the forgotten node into something new, not a weapon, but a key that could reach the switched-off grid and for one moment wake it. He did not wake it to fire, he woke it to speak. The instant Vain stepped into the trap, the relay station reached out through the old buried web and touched every node of the ancient grid at once, and the grid dormant for a year, forgotten by the Empire, quietly rebuilt by a boy who fixed broken things, came awake, and did the one thing Torin had built it to do. It reached up, through the atmosphere to the great black flagship hanging over Solace Bay, and it did not attack it. It talked to it. It spoke to the flagship in the flagship's own language, in the Empire's own protocols Nara had spent a year mapping, and it delivered, in Vane's own authenticated command codes. Codes Torin had captured the moment Vane walked into the station and connected to the local network in his supreme certainty. A single message to the whole of the Vael administrative zone, a message that could not be doubted because it came, verifiably, from the flagship, in the prefect's own hand. The message was Austin Vane's complete confession, not a forgery Torin never forged. It was assembled entirely from Vane's own words, his own reports, his own ledgers, his own recorded recitations of collective accountability, his own cold arithmetic of blood, edited into nothing but the truth of what he was and what he had done, and broadcast on the Empire's own channels to every world of the Vael zone, and through the corridor's relays, beyond, up the chain, all the way up, to the height above Vane that Torin had never been able to make himself imagine. The ascendancy that had disowned Hallex for stealing grain now saw its own prefect, in his own words, confessing to the systematic terror of a compliant world. And worse, far worse for a machine that ran on the belief in its own supremacy, it saw a single unbacked human boy demonstrate before the whole zone that a prefect of the ascendancy could be caught and captured and made to broadcast his own confession from his own flagship, alone, by a farm boy with a wrench. The supremacy cracked. Not the man's, the Empire's. The whole gray apparatus, watching, understood in that moment that its foundational belief, the belief that the conquered were furniture and the ascendancy was untouchable, was a lie, and that the lie had just been proven false on a soft farming world at the edge of the corridor by one grieving child grown into a consequence. Vane's guards moved to kill Torin the instant they understood, and this is where the last piece of the trap closed, the piece that had nothing to do with machines, the world. The relay station on the northern cape was not empty. It had never been empty. For a month the people of Marrow's landing had been coming to it, quietly, in the dark, in ones and twos, not as an army, never as an army but as witnesses, as a world that had leaned into the dark and now chose, freely and without coercion, to stand in the light. When Vane's guards raised their weapons, the doors of the ancient station opened, and the people of Marrow's landing were there, hundreds of them, unarmed, silent, filling every entrance, standing between the guards and the boy, not to fight, because they had no weapons and were not soldiers, but to witness, so that whatever the Empire did next it would do before the eyes of a world and its own broadcasting flagship, in the full light of the truth Torin had just made undeniable. The guards did not fire, they could not. To fire now, before that silent witnessing world and that broadcasting sky, would be to prove the confession true in the same instant it was spoken, would be to become, live and undeniable, the exact atrocity Torin had just made the whole zone see. The supremacy that made them dangerous was the same supremacy that now froze their hands. They could not slaughter a world while the world and the Empire itself were watching, because the whole meaning of the ascendancy was that its violence was order, was mercy, was clean. And there is nothing clean about a dozen soldiers gunning down unarmed witnesses in the light. Austin Vane stood in the center of it all in the ancient chamber, his confession still broadcasting from his own flagship in his own voice, his guards frozen, the world silent in every doorway, and the boy standing before him unarmed and unafraid. And the meticulous machine of a man understood at last completely that he had been caught not by an organization, and not by a weapon, but by a grief he had catalogued as an asset, and that his supremacy had been the leash all along, and that the arithmetic he had come here to correct had corrected him instead. "You could have killed me," Vane said. His cold voice was very quiet now. "The station, you could have made it fire, you didn't." "No," Torin said. "I don't kill men who have been caught. That's your arithmetic prefect." "Not mine. He looked at the frozen guards, at the silent witnessing world, at the sky where the confession still poured out of the flagship for the whole zone to hear. I don't need you dead. I need you seen. There's a difference. It's the difference between us. It always was. The Empire took Austin Vane the way it had taken Halleck's, because the Empire, faced with a prefect who had broadcast his own confession of terror across an entire administrative zone, could do nothing else without admitting that the confession was the Ascendancy's own true face. So the gray apparatus did what such apparatuses always do when their machinery produces an intolerable truth. It disavowed the man and preserved the machine. Vane was recalled. Vane was stripped. Vane was declared a rogue actor whose excesses had never reflected Ascendancy policy. And in disavowing him, the Empire was forced, publicly, before the whole zone, to declare that the terror of Marrow's landing had been a crime, which was a thing the Ascendancy had never once in 200 years been made to say about anything it had done. That admission traveled. Torin had known it would. He had built the whole trap around it. A confession broadcast to one zone is an incident. A confession that forces the Empire to publicly disavow its own methods is a crack in the foundational lie, and cracks in foundational lies travel, world to world, along every relay in the corridor, into places Torin would never see and could not reach. On a dozen other conquered worlds, people who had been furniture heard that a soft farming colony had caught a prefect, and made the Empire call its own terror a crime, and something moved in them that the Ascendancy had spent 2 centuries making sure would never move. The withdrawal from Marrow's landing came 4 months later. It was not a defeat the Empire ever admitted. The Ascendancy did not admit defeats. It was announced as a strategic reallocation, a rationalization of corridor assets, a cold, bureaucratic phrase that fooled no one and was not meant to. But the gray banners came down from the governance hall, and the garrison boarded its drop craft, and the great black flagship that had hung over Solace Bay lifted at last and dwindled and was gone, and the sun that Kessa had woken up to on a bright harvest morning shone down on a market square that was, for the first time in more than 2 years, free. The Empire told itself it had chosen to leave. That was the lie it needed, and Torin let it have the lie, because the lie was itself the victory. A power that consumes worlds one at a time can survive anything except the demonstration that a world can cost more than it yields, and Marrow's landing had become, in the ledgers the Ascendancy loved so much, a world that cost more than it yielded. The friction, the ground-down garrison, the 2 broken sub-prefects, the disavowed prefect, the confession, the crack in the lie, the arithmetic no longer balanced. And the Empire, which ran on arithmetic, did the only thing its arithmetic permitted. It reallocated. It withdrew. It called the withdrawal a choice. Torin watched the flagship dwindle from the roof of the grain house with the old field glasses, and beside him this time stood his mother, no longer hollow, and his father, no longer old, and Nara and Palt and Ren and Osai and old Sella, and behind them, filling the terraces below, the people of a world watching their sky come back. His mother put her hand on his arm. "It's over," she said. "No," Torin said quietly, and she looked at him and saw that the cold, clear engine was still turning, and understood before he said it. "They left one world, Mother. They still hold 100. And the man on the fountain who called Kessa an instruction, he's in a labor pit, and the prefect who put a leash of blood on us is disgraced, and both of those are true, and neither of them is the top of the chain." He lowered the field glasses and looked at the empty sky. "The chain goes up. It goes all the way up, to the height I could never make myself imagine. And now," he almost smiled and did not, "now the height has heard my name." Because that was the thing the confession had done, the thing Torin had built into it from the start. The message that had poured out of Vane's flagship had traveled up the chain as well as out across the zone. Up, past Vane, past the Vael administrative zone entirely, to the vast gray apparatus of the high compliance and the cold offices of the Sovereign Ascendancy proper, where men who moved a quarter of the galaxy around on ledgers had, for the first time, been made to notice a single soft world at the edge of the corridor, and the single human intelligence that had broken it free. They noticed, and noticing, they did what the Empire always did. They resolved to correct the anomaly at the source. The instrument of that correction had a name, and it was a name that made even the disgraced Vael, in his labor pit, go pale when he heard it. High Compliance Executor Torin Vael. She was not a prefect. She was not an administrator. The Ascendancy did not send prefects to correct anomalies that had broken prefects. It sent executors, the machine's antibodies, the cold specialists who existed for exactly one purpose, to find the single point of infection in a rebellious system and burn it out with surgical total finality. Vosk had ended 9 rebellions across the corridor in 20 years. She did not catalog. She did not administer. She did not believe, as Vael had, that the conquered were furniture. She believed nothing at all about them because she did not need to. She was not there to rule a world but to remove a person, and a person requires no philosophy, only a target. She came for Torin the way a scalpel comes for a tumor, and she came alone, because executors worked alone, because the whole terror of them was that they needed no army. She arrived on Marrow's landing 2 months after the Empire's withdrawal quietly on a civilian freighter under a false registry, a single unremarkable gray-eyed woman stepping off at the port of a world that thought itself finally free. She had the confession. She had the files. She knew, as Vael had learned too late, that the ghost was one person, a young human, unbacked and untrained, who fought clean and would not spend the innocent. Unlike Vael, she did not regard that cleanness as a weakness to be exploited with a leash of blood. She regarded it as a targeting parameter. A person who will not spend the innocent can be found by threatening the innocent, not to punish them, but to draw the target into the open. Vosk did not want to grind a world. She wanted one boy in her sights for one instant. That was all an executor ever wanted, and it was always enough. Torin knew she was coming. He had known from the moment the flagship left that the height he had made here his name would answer, and he had spent the 2 months of freedom not resting but preparing, because he understood that the reckoning he had begun in the square was not finished, could not be finished, until it had climbed as high as the chain went, and the chain, he now knew, had sent down its highest instrument to end him. He gathered the ghost's few true lieutenants one last time in the back room at Nara's, and he told them the truth, all of it. "They've sent an executor," he said. "The thing they send when prefects fail. She's here to kill me and only me, and she'll do it by making me choose between myself and you, the same trap Vael tried, sharper. And this time I can't answer it the way I answered Vael, because Vael wanted to rule a world and Vosk wants nothing but my body in her sights. There's no seam of supremacy to widen, because she isn't supreme, she's a scalpel, and scalpels have no ego to overreach. She's the hardest link in the chain because she's the truest expression of what the Empire actually is, underneath the cataloguing and the mercy and the lies. She's the machine with everything unnecessary stripped away, just the killing, just the correction." He looked around the small room at the faces of the people who had made a ghost with him. "And I have to answer her without becoming her. That's the whole thing. That's the only thing. She wants to make me spend you to save myself, or spend myself to save you, and either way I lose. Because either way I've made it about blood, and the moment it's about blood, I'm what they say I am, and Kessa's stall on those screens becomes a lie." "Then how do you beat her?" Nara asked quietly. Torin was silent for a long moment. Outside, the free sky of Marrow's landing was going gold to gray with the turning of the day, the same colors it had been on the morning the great ship first arrived, and he watched the light change through the window, and he thought of a gap-toothed girl who had only wanted to make change like a grown woman, and he found, at last, the shape of the final repair. "The same way I've done everything," he said. "Not with her weapon, with mine. She's a scalpel, she has no ego, no supremacy, no seam of pride to widen. But she has one thing, Nara. One thing every scalpel has, one assumption at the root of everything she is." He looked at them. She assumes that the only thing that matters is the target, that a person is a body, and a body can be found, and finding the body ends the problem. That's the Empire's whole soul, stripped bare, the belief that people are points, that grief is a parameter, that if you kill the one who grieves, the grief dies with him. He stood, and the cold, clear engine turned one final time, and behind it now was something warmer, something that had been growing back all through the long war like teeth growing back in a gap. But that's the lie. That was always the lie. The reckoning was never me, Nara. It was never one body in the dark. I was only ever the first person to say it out loud. The reckoning is what happens when a world stops believing it's furniture, and you can't kill that with a scalpel because it isn't a body. It's an idea, and I'm going to prove it to her. I'm going to make Sovereign Vael understand, before the end, that she came all this way to correct an anomaly that isn't a person at all, and that everything she does to find me only makes the anomaly larger. They did not fully understand him, not yet, but they trusted him, because he had never once spent them to win, because every strike of the long war had been aimed and clean and true, and because the ghost who fought this way had freed their world. So they leaned in, one last time, into the dark that was becoming light, and Torin laid out the final plan, the most dangerous of all, because it required him, at the end, to walk unarmed and alone toward the one enemy who wanted nothing from him but his death. He was not afraid. He had not truly been afraid since the square. Fear was for people who still had something to lose that they had not already lost, and Torin Vael had lost the thing that mattered on a bright harvest morning 2 years before, and everything he had done since had been not the act of a man protecting something, but the act of a man repairing something, and you cannot frighten a man out of a repair. You can only stop him by making the machine whole, or by killing him. And Sovereign Vael, coming through the free streets of Solace Bay with the confession in her files and a scalpel where her soul should have been, did not understand that she had come to kill a repairman, and that repairmen, unlike soldiers, do not need to survive the work. They only need to finish it. The last night before the reckoning, Torin went up to the terrace graveyard as he had gone 100 nights before, and he sat by the flat sea-colored stone in the dark. The copper sea whispered below. The free sky burned with stars the Empire no longer owned. He did not speak for a long time, and then he said, quietly, the last thing he ever said to her before the end. "Almost done, Kessa, one more, the highest one they've sent. And then I'm going to prove the thing you taught me without ever knowing you taught it, that you were never furniture, that none of us ever were, that there was always something in us they could break but never catalog, never own, never kill." He put his hand on the cool stone. "You wanted to make change, do you remember? You wanted to hand the coins across yourself and make change like a grown woman." His voice was very steady. "I'm going to make change, Kessa, for the whole galaxy. Watch." Then he stood, and he went down the terraces in the starlight, toward the free city and the coming scalpel and the last link in the chain, to finish the repair. Sovereign Vael found him faster than Torin had expected, and that was because he had let her. An executor hunts by pressure. She began, within a day of her quiet arrival, to apply it, not the crude collective accountability of Vane, but something finer and more surgical. She let it be known, through the channels an executor knows how to reach, that she had come for one person, and that she would take no others if that one person came to her, and that every day the one person did not come, she would begin, quietly, to make the newly free world remember what the Empire's hand felt like. She detained old Sella first, took her from her home in the night, not to torture her but to be seen taking her, to send the signal up the ghost's own network to the person she knew was listening. She was, in her cold way, precise about it. She wanted no massacre. A massacre would only prove the confession true, and Vael had studied what happened to Vane. She wanted the opposite of a massacre. She wanted a single quiet surrender, in the dark, off camera, with no world watching and no flagship broadcasting. One boy walking into her sights and ending, cleanly and invisibly, so that the anomaly could be corrected, and the Empire's face saved, and the crack in the lie sealed over as though it had never been. She understood, better than any Ascendancy officer before her, exactly what Torin had built and exactly how he had beaten Hallex in vain. She understood that his power was the world's witness, the light, the broadcasting sky, the hundreds of unarmed people in the doorways. And so she designed her hunt to deny him all of it. She would take him in the dark, alone, unwitnessed, and there would be no confession to broadcast and no world to stand in the doorways and no light for the ghost to step into. Scalpel against repairman, in a room where no one could see. Torin let her take Sela, and it cost him, and he held the line. He knew because he understood machines, and Vosk was a machine like all the rest, only cleaner, that Sela would not be harmed while she was useful as bait, and that Sela's usefulness as bait ended the instant Torin surrendered, at which point Sela would be released or killed depending on nothing but Vosk's assessment of tidiness. So he did not surrender to save Sela, because surrendering would not save her. It would only doom them both. Instead he sent Vosk, through the network, a message, a time and a place, and a promise that the ghost would come alone and unarmed. The place was the market square. The time was dawn. The morning, though Vosk did not know it and Torin never told her, of the second anniversary of Kessa's death. Vosk agreed because it suited her. A public square at dawn was empty, controllable. She could seal it, sweep it, ensure no witnesses, no broadcast, no light. She did not understand, could not understand, being a scalpel, why the ghost had chosen the one place on the whole world where his sister had died. She read it as a sentimental weakness, a target making the error of grief, and she noted it as a targeting parameter, and she prepared to correct the anomaly at last, in the gray pre-dawn, on the stones where it had all begun. She sealed the square in the dark. Her people, she had a handful, quiet specialists, not an army, took the rooftops and the stairs and the mouths of the streets. She stood in the center by the harvest fountain, on the very lip where a sub-prefect had once climbed to be seen, and she waited for the boy to come and die. Torin came alone, as promised, up the market stairs he had run down 2 years before, into the sealed and silent square in the gray light before the sun. He was unarmed. He carried nothing. He walked to the center of the square, past the place where a small folding table had once stood, and he stopped a dozen paces from Siren Vosk, and the two of them looked at each other in the dead gray light. The scalpel and the repairman, the highest instrument of the Empire and the boy who had made the stars hear his name. "You're younger than the files," Vosk said. Her voice was flat, without cruelty and without mercy, the voice of a woman reading a measurement. 9 rebellions, and I have never corrected one so young. It should have been an old man. Grief like yours is usually an old man's. "It's not grief anymore," Torin said quietly. "It was at the start. Now it's just true. You came to correct an anomaly. I came to show you what the anomaly actually is before you finish. That's the whole reason I chose this square. Not sentiment. You misread it. Everything your kind does, you misread it because you can only see targets." He looked at her steadily in the gray light. "You think you've come to kill a person. You've come to kill an idea, and you brought a scalpel to do it, and a scalpel is exactly the wrong tool, and I'm going to prove it to you the same way I've proven everything, by making your own certainty do the work." Vosk did not answer. She had heard defiant speeches before, on 9 worlds, and they all ended the same way. She raised her weapon. And the square filled with light. Not weapons fire. Light, real light. The sun cresting the copper sea exactly as it had 2 years before, on schedule, on the anniversary. At the dawn Torin had chosen with the precision of a man who understood machines and orbits and the turning of a world. The gray pre-dawn broke into gold, and the market square that Vosk had sealed and swept and believed empty was revealed, in that flooding light, to be anything but. Because the people had come. Not to fight. Torin had never once, in the whole long war, asked them to fight. They had come to witness, as they had come to the relay station, in 1s and 2s through the dark, past Vosk's specialists who had been watching for an army and had not thought to stop a slow trickle of unarmed civilians drifting toward a square in the night. They filled the terraces above it and the windows around it and the mouths of every street, silent, unarmed in their hundreds and then their thousands, the whole of Solace Bay, and the orchard families and the artisans, and Torin's mother and father, and Nara and Palt and Ren and Osai, and Eden the old priest, and every soul on Marrow's landing who had been furniture in the Empire's catalogue, and had learned from a boy who fixed broken things that they never had been. And it was not only Marrow's landing. This was the last piece of the machine, the piece Torin had built with Nara over the 2 months of freedom, the piece that made the square more dangerous to Sovereign Vosk than any weapon. Nara had spent the war mapping the Empire's relays, and in the 2 months since the withdrawal she had done something no ghost had ever done before. She had opened the road the other way. The old defense grid, rebuilt into a key at the relay station, had been rebuilt further still into an eye and a voice that reached up through the free sky and out along every relay in the corridor. The dawn in the market square of Marrow's landing was not being witnessed only by the world. It was being broadcast, live, unfakeable in Torin's own careful hand, to every conquered world in the Vael corridor and beyond, to all the furniture on all the catalogued worlds, to the height above that had sent the scalpel down. Sovereign Vosk stood in the flooding gold light with her weapon raised at a single unarmed boy, and she understood, in one cold instant, that there was no dark room, that there had never been a dark room, that the repairman had denied her the one thing her whole method required, the absence of the light, and had done it by the most audacious means imaginable. By making the anniversary of a child's death into a sunrise broadcast to a quarter of the galaxy, and standing in the center of it, unarmed, daring the Empire's highest instrument to do, live and undeniable before every conquered world, the exact thing the Empire had spent 2 years, and a prefect's disgrace insisting it did not do. "You can still fire," Torin said quietly, and his voice was carried now, woven through the same broadcast to all the watching worlds. "I'm unarmed. I came alone. You could kill me right now on these stones where my sister died 2 years ago this morning. She was 8. Her name was Kessa. She wanted to sell glasswork and make change like a grown woman, and one of your soldiers shot her because she stepped out to look for our mother, and a man in a gray coat called it instruction and walked away." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You can add me to her, right now, and every furniture world your empire owns is watching you do it. That's the choice I brought you here to make, executor. Not mine, I made mine 2 years ago. Yours. Prove the confession true, live, before the whole corridor. Or lower the weapon and prove that even the Empire's scalpel can be stopped by nothing but a world that refuses to look away." For a long moment, the longest moment of Torin's life, longer than the silence in the square 2 years before, Sovereign Vosk did not move. The weapon stayed level. The gold light poured across the stones. 10,000 people held their breath, and a quarter of the galaxy watched, and the highest instrument of the Sovereign Ascendancy stood at the exact hinge of the reckoning Torin had built, link by patient link, from a fuel manifest to this. And the scalpel did the thing a scalpel is not supposed to be able to do. It hesitated. Because Vosk was a machine, but she was a machine built to correct anomalies at the least cost to the Empire. And in that flooding light, with a quarter of the galaxy watching, her own cold arithmetic, the arithmetic that was the whole of her, the arithmetic Torin had understood and aimed himself at from the start, delivered its verdict. To fire was to lose. To fire was to detonate the confession across every conquered world at once, to prove with her own hand the truth the Empire had spent 2 years denying, to turn the anniversary of a dead child into the founding image of every rebellion the corridor had been quietly growing since the flagship left. The scalpel had come to seal a crack in the lie, and it saw, in the gold light, that firing would not seal the crack but shatter the whole vessel. Her supremacy had no ego to overreach, but her arithmetic had a bottom line, and the bottom line, at last, was inescapable. The anomaly could not be corrected because the anomaly was not a person. It was exactly what the boy had said. It was an idea, standing unarmed in the light, and there is no scalpel in the Empire's whole armory that can cut out an idea. A quarter of the galaxy is watching being born. Siren Vosk lowered the weapon. She did it slowly with no expression, the way she did everything, and she looked at the young man standing unarmed in the gold light on the stones where his sister had died, and she said quietly, so quietly that only the broadcast caught it, and through the broadcast, everyone, you were never the target. I see it now. There was never a target. And then, because she was a machine and machines report, she said the last thing, the thing that finished the reckoning Torin had begun in the square 2 years before. The Ascendancy will hear that its scalpel could not cut. It will hear it from me. I do not lie in my reports. That is the one thing I have. She turned and she walked out of the square, alone, across the gold-lit stones, unhurried, and Torin watched her go the way he had once watched a man in a gray coat walk away, except that this time it was the Empire's highest instrument walking away defeated, in the full light, before the eyes of every world it had tried to keep in the dark. She released old Sella that same hour. She left Marrow's landing on the freighter she had come on. And her report honest, because it was the one thing she had went up the chain to the height above, and told the Sovereign Ascendancy the truth it could least afford to hear, that a soft farming world at the edge of the corridor had defeated a prefect and turned back an executor, and that the thing it had defeated the Empire with could not be found and could not be killed, because it was not a person and never had been. It was a world that had stopped believing it was furniture, and it was spreading. It spread. Torin lived to see it spread, though he never left Marrow's landing again and never wanted to. He had done his repair. The rest belonged to the worlds themselves, and to the image that burned now in the memory of a quarter of the galaxy. The gold dawn, the unarmed boy, the scalpel that could not cut, the 2-year-old grief that had grown into the thing the Empire had no name for and no defense against. On world after conquered world along the Vael corridor, the furniture watched that broadcast, and understood it in their bones the way the people of Marrow's landing had understood the empty stall, and something moved in them that 200 years of compliance had failed to keep still. Not everywhere at once, not overnight. But the crack in the foundational lie, once shattered in the gold light of that anniversary dawn, could not be sealed, and it ran along every relay in the corridor and into the deep worlds beyond, and the Sovereign Ascendancy, the largest power the arm of the galaxy had ever known, the machine that had eaten a quarter of the stars one world at a time, began, for the first time in its history, to contract. They said, in the years that followed, on 100 worlds throwing off the gray, that it had started with a child. That the Empire had killed one human child in a market square on a bright harvest morning and called it instruction and walked away, and that the stars had burned for their mistake, not all at once, not in fire, but in the slow, inexorable spread of a world's refusal to be furniture, which is a fire the Empire's water could not reach. They did not always know the name Torin Vael in those far places. The ghost had never wanted a name. But they knew the stall, and the glass, and the gap-toothed girl, and the 4 words that had answered the Empire's 4 words, everything has a cost. And they knew that a power which believes the conquered are furniture will one day meet the one piece of furniture that grieves, and that grief, given a mind that understands machines and a line it will not cross, is the most patient and terrible force in the galaxy. Torin grew old on Marrow's landing. That was the strangest thing to him in the end, that he grew old at all, that the repairman survived the work when he had never planned to and had never needed to. He fixed pumps again. He fixed engines. He married late, a woman who had stood in the doorways of the relay station on the night of Vane's fall, and he had children, and he told them about their Aunt Kessa, who had wanted to make change like a grown woman, and who had, in a way she never knew, made more change than anyone in the history of the corridor. And every year on the anniversary, He went up to the terraced graveyard above the Alden orchard, and he sat by the flat sea-colored stone, and he watched the sun crest the copper sea, gold to gray to gold, the same light, the same dawn, and he told his sister how the stars were doing. "Another one this year, Kessa," he would say, on the last anniversary before his own long life ended, an old man now, the one thing the story had never allowed him to be until it was finally safely over. "A world called Thren 3 jumps coreward. They put your stall on their governance hall the day they raised their own flag. Not our stall, theirs, but yours underneath, always yours." The sea whispered below. The free sky, emptied now for light years of the gray banners, burned overhead. "You made change," the old man said quietly, his hand on the cool stone where it had rested 100 times across a long life. "For the whole galaxy, just like you wanted. I told you to watch." He smiled at last, the smile he had not been able to smile on the morning it all began. "I hope you were watching, little one. I hope you saw. The stars burned for their mistake, and the light of them is still spreading, and it will spread long after I'm gone, world by world, dawn by dawn, until there's no dark left in the whole corridor for them to hide their catalog in. Because you were never furniture, Kessa. None of us ever were, and they will never ever forget it." The sun cleared the sea. The light poured gold across the terraces and the orchards and the flat sea-colored stones, across a free world under a free sky, and an old man sat in it beside his sister's grave with his eyes closed, and his face turned up to the warmth. And somewhere out along the burning corridor, another world was raising its flag, and putting an empty stall of bright glass on its wall, and learning the 4 words that a grieving boy had once written in answer to an empire that thought it on the stars. Everything has a cost. The empire had learned it too late and paid it forever.